Robinson, who's going to be talking about cutting shit, collaborating in your IDS.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, before we get started here, quick show of hands. How many of you are responsible for managing an IDS in some aspect? How many of you got thrown into the situation and had no idea what you were doing? How many of you are familiar with this little piece of software called Snort? Good, that's most of you. My name is Tony Robinson. My talk is on IDS and NSM, cutting the shit. This is a little bit of a who am I. I'm going to kind of go over it briefly for the interest of saving time. Y'all can come in, get to know me a little bit afterwards after the talk or something. But I'm a senior security analyst for Exelon, big SCADAs, ICS, all that good stuff. And here's some of my contact information. I can tell you more about like my past life and all that crap later. So this is the reason why I am here today. Full disclosure, I used to work for SourceFire, and I have seen some shit. I have seen everything from people who turn on every single signature and then complain when their production networks go down, to people who have deployed something as a knee-jerk reaction and put it in line, and again, their production network goes down, to we're logging all this stuff to our SIM, but it's providing no value because the analysts are going nuts because there's too much data. If you name it, I've probably seen it. So the goals of the talk here, just briefly, is we're going to go over things to reduce noise and get more valuable data out of your IDS. Why and how you would want to do this. Doing data correlation. You know, a lot of people say that correlation with IDS is a very difficult thing to pull off properly. You know, getting extra tools in place that will help you say definitively, you, user over here, we're at this site, I can prove that you've gotten infected, and I'm going to nuke your laptop, have a nice day. Then a couple of little toys and projects that I've been working on, a couple of open source things that I've released, you know, just InfoSec toys. So we're going to start with less noise and more signal, you know. A common complaint that I get all the time when I was doing professional services work and technical support is that the IDS is a noise box. We have too many false positives. Holy crap, this thing's CPU is at like 90%. What's going on here? You know, the extra data that you get from your IDS is the whole reason you put it in place. You want to know, you want to see the things that you couldn't see before. Sometimes, though, it can be incredibly obnoxious when you're having those false positives, or even in the case when you have true positives and you're literally getting an alert every 5 seconds. Jesus Christ, I know it's infected. Hold on. You know, a couple of factors to consider here. We're going to go over briefly on separate slides here are, you know, placing your sensors on your network. Variables to configure in your snort.conf or in Suricata, the YAML configuration file that they use. Disabling irrelevant rules, using proper rule management tools for your open source deployments. And finally, noise reduction techniques that are built into Snort and Suricata. Before we go on any further, I am going to refer to them as being more or less the same, you know, before people start throwing crap at me. They're more or less the same under the hood with some minor things here and there. So, without further ado, I'm going to get started with sensor placement. It's just a fact of life. One sensor will not meet all of your NSM needs if you have a relatively large network. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule. If you're a small business, then you can probably get away with a single sensor and you're good to go. But for the majority out there, a single sensor just isn't going to cut it no matter how well tuned you have it. Putting them in more places, and by more places I mean like your ingress-egress points in your network, or in the DMZ, or at your core, you know, where your core switches are in the network, or at the distribution layers closest to like the engineering department or the finance department. Putting more sensors in more places just makes more sense. It makes it easier to tune each individual sensor, and it gives you a little bit more correlation and a little bit more context with those alerts. If you can't do it all, you know, you don't have that capital expenditure, that OpEx to have the analyst handle all those events or buy all of those sensors, start small. Start with one sensor at a time. The most important place I usually would recommend to start is definitely at your ingress-egress points, and to reduce the amount of pain you have to deal with, start behind any NAT devices you got or proxies. This will save you a lot of pain in the future. This is just a diagram that I threw together, and it's a mess of arrows going all over the freaking place, but the general idea is that each of these little boxes right here, the IDS and IPSs, those are different areas of the network, and they're looking at traffic, and they have context into different users or different servers that your applications or your systems are going to. Again, more being better, and again, I'm being a realist here, you might not be able to cover all that in the beginning. Just build your deployment and scale it as you go. So, having covered placement, we're going to go briefly into IP variables and port variables. These are in the snort.conf file that pretty much is the brains behind Snort. Tells it how to function, tells it what IP addresses are what ports go where. I saw a lot of hands go up. You all should know what this is. So starting with port variables, these are like TCP and UDP port numbers that a rule should apply to. They can take port ranges, a comma separate a list of ports, or even substitute the value of another port variable. IP variables work pretty much the same as port variables, except you're looking at IP addresses. They take CIDR notation, comma separate a list of IP addresses, and again, you can substitute the value of one IP variable and put it inside of another. Just a small note here, some people miss is that the preprocessors in Snort and Suricata, they have their own settings and their own IP address configurations. Just a little aside, I've seen that missed a couple of times, and that sprouts false positives all over the place. This is just a diagram that kind of shows you what the snort.conf file looks like for port and IP variables. That text is way too small, and I apologize, but you see IPvar up here of HomeNet. Any is a special keyword with Snort saying any IP address can be a home network address. Generally speaking, that's one of the first things that you want to change is defining that HomeNet variable to a CIDR block that you want to protect, and usually setting external net to either any or bang HomeNet, which is in Snort speak, that's not HomeNet. And then down here, we define, this is how you would define port variables, and here's a good example with the HTTP port variables. These are ports where you would expect to see a web server, or where Snort should expect to see web servers, and some of those web-related rules should be applied. And again, you can refer to other IP variables, you can refer to other port variables within another variable. It's pretty straightforward. You can also define your own variables. That's perfectly fine, and Snort will let you do that just as well. So why are we doing all this? What's the importance of this? Why should you care about setting these? A lot of Snort rules rely on those variables accurately reflecting your network, accurately reflecting where you're deploying that sensor. And if they're not given any attention or love, if you just go in with a straight HomeNet any, external net any, you're going to have a very bad time. It's going to be a lot of fun to clean up. So if nothing else, the first thing to focus on would be getting proper IP address ranges for your HomeNet and your external net values. Generally speaking, if you don't have that documented, a couple of places that I've had tremendous luck is talking to your sysadmins and getting DHCP scopes. If you can get those exported and just in a little CSV file, that's really awesome. It helps set up your home networks. It helps you to actually learn what networks certain applications are running on, and you get the bonus later for FRAG3 and Stream 5 preprocessors. You get to know what operating systems and what applications are on what subnetworks, and it helps to configure those preprocessors and make them more accurate just as well. So another area to look for your port variables would be what firewall rules do you have in place on your network currently? What is your firewall allowing? What is it disallowing? And if there are any port variables in your snort configuration file that are relevant to that, just reflecting what your firewall profile, what your firewall rules look like. If you're still lost, at a minimum, like I set up here, you want to start focusing with your home net and external net variables. Just start with your generic RFC 1918 address ranges. Your 192.168.0.0, that's /16, your 172.16, and your 10 dot network. And just as you start getting events, or as you get that information from those other groups, or you start bribing your admins with beer, just fill that out. That's all there is to it. So we're going to move on to tuning the rule set here, and I'm going to make this ridiculously fast. Show of hands, how many of you here have not heard of pulled pork? Okay, well, just for you guys and just for our fine viewers on the internet, pulled pork is an open source project. It was made by J.J. Cummings at SourceFire, and it's a godsend for rule management. It downloads the latest rules. It automatically configures them. There are tons of settings that define what rules are enabled or disabled. It handles your local rules, and it slices and dices and purees. So if you aren't using it, definitely use it. So the next portion here, talking about those little internal features to do noise reduction. We're going to start here with a little bit of a brief anatomy of a snort rule because this is relevant to what I am going to talk about. So as most of you know, there's two major sections of a snort rule. There's the header with IP addresses and ports, and then there's the body that defines what content matches you're actually looking for when you see a conversation with those IP addresses or on those individual port ranges. And here is like an example rule that I pulled up. It's for a logmein.com connection. And you can see up here there's the rule header where we're looking at a specific action to take, what protocol, TCP, UDP, ICMP, what IP address variables we want this rule to apply to, and port numbers that we want this rule to apply to, as well as what direction we want this to go in. And then the rule body defines what content matches we're doing or what unique things that we want to see in this connection before we trigger an alert. And that's kind of broken up down a little bit down here too. Your rule action, your protocols, your IP addresses, the directionality. It's all fairly straightforward. So we're going to start by talking about like those those nice techniques to reduce noise. I'm going to start with pass rules. Pass rules are incredibly effective. Essentially, all you're doing with a pass rule is you're modifying the header of a snort rule ever so slightly to where it only is effective with a few IP addresses or a couple of ports. All you're doing is mainly just messing with the header and copying and pasting. And this basically allows you to squelch out noise for a particular set of IP addresses that you know are generating false positives for a single rule while allowing that rule to still be active for the rest of your network. And this next page here gives an example. Again, this is our logmein.com rule. It's the same rule that was on the last page. We're looking at traffic from external net on port 443 coming into our home network with logmein.com in the stream. And then all we're doing down here is we're changing alert to pass. We're changing this to a single IP address that we don't want this to apply to, and maybe adding a note here from the message to let us know what this pass rule was for. And then down here giving it a different snort signature ID number and a revision number for us to track that. And this basically says if you see this content match for this particular IP address and this port, just ignore it. Don't generate an alert. It's fine. Next, I'm going to discuss suppressions, limits, and thresholds. In layman's terms, suppressions basically stop the rule from firing without removing the rule from your rule set. I don't like them as much as pass rules because with those pass rules, you can be very granular. You can add extra content matches. You can add different ports and IP addresses and a bunch of different criteria. Where a suppression operates on basically a source or a destination IP address and a signature ID number for snort. Thresholding is the concept that a rule must match or a content match must occur a certain number of times within a certain number of seconds before we trigger a single alert. Then finally we have limits here that say we only want to see X number of alerts if it's triggered within Y number of seconds. I personally love limits the most. In comparing thresholds and limits, I like using limits a lot more. It helps in reducing the noise. It helps in those situations where you know your host is infected with something, but you're not being chain gunned with those alerts every 5 seconds, every 20 seconds. You know, just say I only want to see this alert this many times in this period in seconds. And I'll show an example on the next page here of what a limit looks like. So we have here for our logmein.com rule, we say that we want that particular generator ID, that Snort signature. We're telling Snort that this is a limit and that we want to track it by the source IP address that generated it. We only want to see one event every 3,600 seconds, so that's one event per hour. That's enough to let me know that this activity is going on and it's not filling up the console, filling up the SIM with extra worthless alerts. And down here we have an example of a threshold, and thresholds kind of work in an opposite manner where, you know, we still have the generator ID and the signature ID, but instead we're tracking if 10 events occur within 60 seconds, that's when I want to see an alert pop up on my console or go to the SIM. So I added this one in at the last minute. Snort has a relatively new feature, IP reputation. It's just IP whitelisting and blacklisting. Basically, blacklisted IPs, the way it works in storage is if it sees one that is part of that blacklist, that pulled pork incidentally will pull down for you automatically. It's just the alert's generated, there's no further processing done, we know this is bad traffic, let's move on. And again, it works in a similar manner for whitelisted IP addresses. This is a known good IP address. We don't care about it. Let's move on. It's a little bit lower in the Snort's software stack in terms of processing traffic, doing normalization with preprocessors, scanning against signatures. It's lower in that software stack. So these are pretty efficient. If you know that there are certain IP addresses on your network that you have vulnerability scanners or things of that nature that you know are noisy and are going to generate false positives, just white or blacklist them right off the bat and you're good to go. The downside is that your only criteria, of course, is IP address. You know, pass rules are a little bit more surgical, but they operate further up the up that stack, so to speak, after signature, during signature processing. I'll show a diagram of that in just a little bit here. And of course, we come to the old standby, Berkeley packet filtering. If you're familiar with TCP dump, you've probably seen a Berkeley packet filter sometime in your life. I got a link in here on my slide deck that has been absolutely awesome in teaching Berkeley packet filters for Snort. I'll be releasing this slide deck after the talk. It's absolutely awesome. Basically what this allows you to do is when Snort is doing traffic acquisition and just picking up that traffic off the wire, the Berkeley packet filter allows you to just ignore it straight out as soon as the traffic comes in. It's even more efficient than those whitelist rules or the IP reputation preprocessor in that aspect. But I'm going to give an example here of a simple BPF. Right up here near the top, that is not, and all this in parentheses here is not TCP protocol and port 443 and host 192.168.1.2. And that just translates into I don't care about TCP traffic where this host IP address is a source or a destination for that traffic on port 443. The pros being is that if you're really good with Berkeley packet filtering, they can be even more surgical than pass rules are. The downside is that Berkeley packet filtering is black magic, and I am a firm believer in that. It's very easy to paint very broad strokes, like this Berkeley packet filter I have up here. This is going to ignore all HTTPS traffic going to my box. And in some cases, that might be something that you want to do. In most cases, probably not. And that's just a basic example. So I said that I had a diagram up here that kind of explains Snort's software stack a little bit and where these noise reduction techniques kind of fit in. And here we have, your data on the wire. This is the data that's coming from your tap or your span port. And then the first thing Snort's doing is acquiring that data, acquiring that network traffic. This is where your BPFs are going to take place as a noise reduction technique. Then you come up here to your traffic normalization, your FRAG3, your Stream 5 preprocessors, the application layer preprocessors. IP reputation is in this area. Generally speaking, the lower in the stack it is, the faster Snort can make a determination whether or not this is good or bad or something that you care about. So the lower you can do this, or the lower you can use your noise reduction techniques, the faster it's going to make it and the more efficient your IDS is going to be. Oh, 5 minutes. So basically to recap, there's all sorts of sensor placement options you have, IP and port variables to define, rule management tools, options for noise reduction that are built into Snort. And that's more or less this for that section. I'm going to briefly skim over correlation because I have a ton of crap to go over yet. I'm sorry. So I'm going to go over a couple of tools that we use in our enterprise, HTTP Pry, Passive DNS, Argus, and last but not least, of course, Bro. Pry is basically open source HTTP header parsing. This tool pairs really well with malware CNC, blacklist user agent, URI, and exploit kit rules from the Snort rule set. And it basically allows you to record HTTP headers on the wire as long as you give it a network feed. And this next page is just kind of a brief example. This is my web client requesting Twitter. You can see my user agent, the IP address, what time it happened, all the options that are in the HTTP headers, and what response I got back from the server. Passive DNS works almost just like HTTP Pry. You give it a passive traffic feed, and any DNS queries it sees across the wire, it's going to log them. Good for malware hunting, good for looking at your CNC domains and IP addresses, but recursive DNS makes this sort of a pain in the ass to use in very large enterprise environments because oftentimes you're not going to get that source IP address. You're going to get your Active Directory server that's querying your primary domain name server or something of that nature. Here's an example. You can see queries that for me doing an apt-get install on one of my systems and me going to Twitter and posting something. And then finally we have Argus and NTOP, which are metadata for traffic. Those are your initiator and responders, source and destination IP addresses, what protocols and ports, how many bytes were transferred, and information of that nature in the session. This isn't full packet capture, this is just metadata about that session that occurred. And here's a screen cap. I mean, I know it's really tiny, but you can see that there's ICMP traffic here, that there's TCP traffic, that there's ARP here, just the metadata, how many bytes, how many total packets, who initiated the connection, and things of that nature. And then basically all I want to really say about Bro is that it does all of that by default. It does the HTTP header parsing, it does passive DNS, it does a little bit of flow monitoring, and it also does, it can log services, it can log software it's seen on the network, it can do connection summaries, and all of this is without knowing the Bro scripting language. This is just compiling it and pointing at a traffic feed. I generated this data in a single evening. Just to recap again, these are tools that will help make making sense of your IDS events a little bit easier. If you get an HTTP alert for a known exploit kit signature, you can go through your HTTP pry logs and correlate that as an example. You can correlate the DNS hits, things of that nature. It makes making sense of your IDS logs that much easier. And in this final section here, I'm just going to go over a couple of little neat open source projects that I've been working on in my spare time. The first one here being AutoSnort. The long story short, this is a program this is a set of scripts that I developed that will take you from a base operating system out of the list here install all your prerequisites for Snort, install a nice web front end, MySQL, get everything up and running to get you a standalone stancer as soon as possible. At the bottom there is just the web interfaces and the output interfaces that my script will automate for you. This is just a screen cap as an example. It's very Metasploit-like. It'll give you an example of what's going on here. Yellow being informational events, green being good events, blue being what am I doing right now, and red asterisk there being, you know, this is something bad that's happened. Look at the error logs or send them to me and complain to me. Unlimited is just a really simple Python script that I threw together for generating thresholds and limits for Snort to include in your Snort configuration files. It takes a comma-separated file, and it will produce those threshold and limit statements for you for creating a separate configuration file full of them. And overall, just make that whole threshold and limit generation portion a lot easier for you to do. It runs Python 2.7, and it works for Windows and Linux. And this is just a screen cap here. I'm almost done, please. And that's just a screen capture of what the script does and what it looks like. It will handle all of the generation. It'll show you what the output looks like, and it'll put it into a text file for you. And then Blind Seeker is just a wiki and a blog that I have set up. It's just a information security-centric wiki that I have for discussing all sorts of security techniques, mainly centered around IDS right now, like introductory IDS concepts and IPS concepts. Feel free to go there, take a look at it, tell me what you think, tell me what you'd like to see, tell me what isn't clear, and I'll add to it as soon as I have time to do it. And that's basically about it right now. I give shout outs and thank yous, but I'm already over time. I severely apologize. Again, if you want to get to know me, I'll be out in the hall, and I'll see you guys there.